the body a new member, but somebody who really understands the world and a tremendous supporter of the U.S.-Israel relationship, Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Senator Graham, and I appreciate this, and I rise here in support of these sanctions as well. I mean, Americans are perhaps tempted these days to take a step back from the problems of places like the Middle East and wonder, why do we need to be active in resolving these thorny issues that often seem unsolvable? But yesterday in the Foreign Relations Committee, for example, we discussed Syria legislation and debated how to address the growing repercussions of our policy and action as violence and instability spread beyond Syria's borders. But we can't just stand idly by and ignore the fallout from Syria. Americans need to remember that Iran is not just Israel's problem, it's ours as well. Iran has been sponsoring terrorism and killing Americans for decades, most recently in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Iran has pursued an anti-tyrant, it's undermined U.S. allies, and not just in the Middle East, and through its terrorist proxies like Hezbollah, and what they're doing now to defend Assad in Syria, but they've even done it in our own hemisphere. And on top of these issues, Iranian leaders have denied that the Holocaust even happened, and they threatened Israel's very existence. So we do need to strengthen our sanctions, and we need to actually follow through with them, and that's what this resolution calls on the administration to do. But we also have to ensure that our international partners do that as well. So I'm pleased that this resolution calls on the administration to fully implement the sanctions that we've already passed and approved of. But these sanctions have not changed Iran's calculus. So sanctions alone are not enough, because as we've seen, Iran has added centrifuges, they continue to enrich uranium, and they get closer to their nuclear capability. Similarly, the approach of this administration to talk of Iran trying what our European partners have attempted to do in the past has also been unsuccessful. For more than 10 years now, we and the Europeans have tried to negotiate, all with no results, and Iran has only gotten closer and closer to a nuclear capability. So we need a new approach. One avenue that has not been adequately explored is using perhaps our greatest weapon, what Ronald Reagan called the will and the moral courage of free men and women. And this means speaking out more forcefully about human rights situation in Iran. This regime is a brutally repressive one. It represses its own people. You should read the 2012 State Department report. It talks about disappearances, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment, including judicially sanctioned amputations and flogging, politically motivated violence and repression, such as beatings and rape, harsh, life-threatening conditions in detention and prison facilities. This is not even a comprehensive list of the abuses that exist in Iran. There's currently an American pastor in Iran, Saeed Abedini, who is serving 8 years in prison because he's a Christian and practices Christianity. Just yesterday, the Iranian government disqualified 2 presidential candidates. It's a sham election that's coming up in the coming months here. And so, as one State Department official put it to the Foreign Relations Committee, the Green movement in Iran today is virtually non-existent. And that's because instead of denigrating the freedom fighters in Iran who have suffered from inaction and lack of support, we need to be doing everything possible in the weeks to come to speak frankly about the lack of fundamental freedoms in Iran and reject the notion that this regime is legitimate or a credible negotiating partner. We need to make clear that a crackdown against the Iranian people, similar to the one that occurred in June of 2009, after a fraudulent presidential election, will have real consequences this time. We can't be everywhere, America can't be everywhere and do everything, but we can't outsource the solutions to all our problems either. Now, Israel faces an unprecedented security environment. I saw this firsthand during my recent visit to the Middle East in February. In every direction, what Israel sees is uncertainty and potential instability, from all-out civil war on the northern border in Syria to neighbors going through delicate political transitions in the wake of the Arab Spring. But even with all these changes in its neighborhood, the greatest challenge facing Israel today is the threat of a nuclear Iran, and we need to stand with Israel and provide diplomatic, military, and economic support in its defense of its territory, its people, and its existence. And we need to remind Tehran that the United States will not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons, as this resolution states, and that's why I'm supporting it, and I urge all my colleagues to support it as well. Thank you.
Senator, for a very terrific speech. Senator Mendez, do you mind if Senator McCain goes, or how would you?
I am always willing to allow Senator McCain to.
We'll do this by 8. Senator McCain's recognized for 5 minutes. Not quite a minute a decade, but that'll get us going.
Senior Senator from Arizona is recognized.
I thank the chair, and I hope the chair will discipline this disrespect that's being displayed just because of my advanced age. This would never have happened during the Coolidge administration, which I first served. I thank the President. I also would like to thank my dear friend Lindsey Graham for bringing this this important resolution to the Senate. Resolutions happen all the time. This is a very important one, and it wouldn't have happened without the leadership and support of the distinguished chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. I'd like to thank him for his continued leadership, including the passage of the resolution that was passed through the Foreign Relations Committee yesterday concerning the situation in Syria. Mr. President, I would ask inclusion in the record three articles that I think are of importance for our colleagues. One is entitled, the Washington Post, Iran paves over suspected nuclear testing site despite UN protests. The second is another Washington Post, Associated Press, Iran expands nuke technology for program that could be used to make weapons. And, of course, it's of interest, another one, Iranian soldiers fighting for Assad in Syria. I would ask unanimous consent that they be made part of the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I join with 90 members of the Senate to support this resolution. And with this resolution has extraordinary bipartisan support. The Senate will send a clear and unequivocal message to the regime in Tehran, and that it is this: the United States will not allow you to get a nuclear weapons capability. The dangers of a nuclear Iran cannot be denied or diminished or dismissed. We must continue to ratchet up the pressure through sanctions, as this resolution suggests. But at the end of the day, sanctions are a means to an end, not an end unto themselves. And unfortunately, despite the unprecedented international sanctions that have been put in place, Iran is today closer to a nuclear weapons capacity than ever before, and the facts speak for themselves. In January 2009, according to the IAEA, the Iranians had approximately 1,000 kilograms of uranium enriched to 3.5%. Today, they have more than 8,000 kilograms. In January 2009, Iran had not enriched to 20%. Today, the IAEA reported that Iran has produced 324 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium. That's 44 kilograms more than 3 months ago. It means that they are moving unabated and unhindered towards the development of a nuclear weapon, and it continues to deny AE inspectors entry to nuclear facilities while the centrifuges continue to increase dramatically. A few hours ago, the IAEA issued a report that states Tehran has installed close to 700 high-tech centrifuges, which will exponentially increase the speed with which Iran will be able to enrich uranium. So, Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons capability cannot be divorced from its other destabilizing actions, and the threat from Iran is comprehensive. It includes ongoing threats against Israel and other allied Arab governments across the region. It includes a decades-long campaign of unconventional warfare, and it includes Iran's ongoing role as the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world. Let's not forget that Iran has bolstered violent extremist groups such as Hezbollah and Shiite militias in Iraq that are responsible for the murders of hundreds of young American forces and innocent civilians, or that senior leaders of the Quds Force were implicated in a terrorist plot to assassinate Saudi Arabia's ambassador by the United States on U.S. soil. The Iranian regime continues to undertake its full-fledged campaign of brutality to keep Bashar al-Assad in power in Syria. Senior Iranian officials are advising and assisting the Syrian military with intelligence support, weapons, and they have undertaken, together with Hezbollah, a large-scale training effort of as many as 50,000 militiamen. As today's Washington Post makes clear, Iranian soldiers are fighting on the ground in Syria, supporting the regime as it massacres innocent civilians. I ask you that whether this is in America's national security interest. The threat from Iran is more deadly and serious than nearly any I've seen in my lifetime. I don't think this threat will be fully resolved until a very different set of leaders is in power in Tehran, until we see an Iranian government that reflects the will of the Iranian people. I'm confident that the current regime that rules Iran will not last forever, for the simple reason the Iranian people want the same freedoms and rights as people elsewhere. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this amendment. Again, I want to thank the senator from South Carolina, Senator Graham, for his hard work on this resolution for a change.
Thank you, Senator McCain, for your voice on this topic and any other topic that keeps America safe. Senator Menendez, without which there would be no resolution, and Senator Reid is not here, but I want to for making the time available to have this vote.
Thank you, Mr.
The
President.
senator for New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. President, how much time is there a division of time here?
Majority controls 20 minutes.
Okay. Mr. President, I recognize myself at such time as I may consume. Let me start off by thanking and congratulating my colleague, Senator Graham, for joining with me, for engaging me on this critical question. He knows my concern about Iran's march towards nuclear weapons, and together we thought it was an important statement to make. I appreciate his leadership on this issue and bringing us to a point that I think we will have a remarkably strong bipartisan vote today to send a very clear message. And the message, Mr. President, is that we seek full implementation of U.S. and international sanctions on Iran and urging the President to continue to strengthen enforcement of those sanctions. I cannot emphasize enough my strong concerns about Iran's nuclear program and the extraordinary threat it poses, yes, to Israel, but very importantly to the United States of America and to the entire international community. Iran's provocative actions threaten to not just undo regional stability, but it poses an existential threat to our ally Israel, and clearly a very real threat to U.S. national security. Iran continues to export terrorist activity directly and through proxies like Hezbollah. It continues to actively support the Assad regime in Syria with fighters, arms, and petroleum. It continues its unrelenting drive for nuclear weapons, placing it at the top of our list of national security concerns. In my view, it remains the paramount national security challenge we face, certainly in the Middle East, if not the world. Mr. President, we're at a crossroads in our Iran policy, and the question today is, what do we do next? The Obama administration, in concert with the Congress, has pursued a dual-track approach of diplomacy and sanctions. 2 weeks ago, members of the Foreign Relations Committee met with Lady Ashton, who has led the diplomatic track with the P5+1 along with Undersecretary Sherman. The talks have been central in demonstrating to the world that it is Iran and not the United States that is acting in bad faith, and it is Iran that, through its obstinance, has helped galvanize the international community to increase the pressure. But the talks have failed to achieve their central objective, which is getting Iran to make concessions on their nuclear program. It is clear to me that we cannot allow the Iranians to continue to drag their feet by talking while all the while they grow their nuclear program. Iran is proceeding at a fast pace. Today, as has been mentioned, the International Atomic Energy Agency, in its quarterly report, said that Iran has installed almost 700 advanced IR-2M centrifuges at Natanz, an increase of more than 500 centrifuges since February of this year. These are centrifuges that can more efficiently and more quickly enrich uranium. The IAEA's report also again expressed concern about the possible military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program. We cannot allow Iran to buy more time by talking, even as the centrifuges keep spinning. There is no doubt, and there has never been a doubt, certainly not in my mind, that a nuclear-armed Iran is not an option for the United States national security. And that's why I have been fully dedicated to doing everything we can to stop Iran from ever crossing that threshold. It's why I introduced, along with Senator Graham, this resolution that makes clear that a nuclear Iran is not an option and that the United States has Israel's back. And it's why I've come to this floor time after time as an author of some of the toughest sanctions that one country has ever levied against another, the sanctions against Iran. Working closely with my colleague, Senator Kirk, and with the Obama administration, we have implemented these sanctions in a way that is truly strangling the Iranian economy. Iran's leaders must understand that unless they change their course, their situation will only get worse, and economic struggles and international isolation will grow. They must understand that at the end of the day, their pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability will make them less, not more secure. I also want to say something about Iran's unacceptable and deplorable approach to the State of Israel and its continued threats to the Jewish state. As the President has made clear time and again, America's commitment to Israel's security is unshakable. I share the President's commitment to Israel's security, and I know my colleagues do as well. Every time Iran makes outrageous threats, it only succeeds in further uniting the world against it and strengthening America's resolve. I strongly support the close and unprecedented security cooperation that the administration has pursued with Israel, and I know that this cooperation will only continue and deepen. And I am deeply committed to doing everything I can to ensure that Israel is able to defend itself. While this resolution makes absolutely clear that we are not authorizing the use of force, it does also make clear that we have Israel's back, and specifically that if Israel is compelled to take military action in self-defense against Iran's nuclear program, that we should stand with Israel, using all the tools of our national power to assist Israel in defense of its territory, its people, and its very existence. The bottom line is that Israel should always understand that the United States has its back, that we will not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons capability, and if we are forced to, we will take whatever means necessary to prevent this outcome. As the President has reiterated on numerous occasions, all options are on the table. And that message, along with the solidarity of this chamber, I intend to take with me in my visit to Israel later this week. Mr. President, the simple fact is we need to continue to apply pressure, and we must bring along the international community in our effort. This has been incredibly important because while we have led, we have had a multiplier effect by the multilateral support of the European Union and others so that our sanctions really can bite. And they have been biting. Iran's crude oil exports have been cut in half from 2.5 million barrels per day in 2011 to approximately 1.25 million barrels per day now. Iran still had energy sector exports, however, of $83 billion in 2012, including $60 billion in oil and another $23 billion in natural gas, fuel oil, and condensates. The sanctions are working, but they aren't enough, and they aren't working fast enough. So in my view, we need to double down on 4 fronts. First, we need to encourage further reductions in energy sector purchases from Iran, including purchases of petroleum, fuel oil, and condensates, and prevent Iran from engaging in trade in precious metals to circumvent sanctions. Second, we need to ensure that we've prohibited trade with Iran with respect to all dual-use items that can be used in Iran's nuclear program. That means adding additional industry sectors to the trade prohibition list. Third, we need to ask the international community to ramp up the pressure and change Tehran's calculus. A nuclear Iran, after all, isn't only an American problem. And fourth, the time may also have come to look more seriously at all options, and that would include increasing military presence and pressure against Iran. I believe there still may be time for diplomacy to work, but increased military pressure could signal to the Supreme Leader that a nuclear program will undermine the security of his regime, not improve it. Fundamentally, the challenge remains a difficult one, and we're walking a fine line. But this resolution says to the Supreme Leader in Iran that we will not let up. We will continue to apply pressure, and that this continued pursuit of nuclear weapons is threatening the very existence of his regime. I urge my colleagues to support the Graham-Menendez resolution and full implementation of U.S. international sanctions on Iran. We are considering other options before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as well as working with our colleagues on the Senate Banking Committee to make it very clear that we will exercise and exhaust all options that are peaceful diplomacy to try to achieve our ultimate goal. But this resolution makes it very clear to the world. Mr. President, we stand behind you as you stand behind Israel. And Israel, we continue to be your faithful ally. We recognize you as a clear democracy in a challenging part of the world, a major security partner of the United States, and the one country most likely to be voting with us in international organizations in common cause with common values. And that's what I think this vote will be about tonight. Mr. President, we reserve the balance of our time because I do believe we have another colleague who wishes to speak, and I will yield the floor.
Mr. President, how much
Senator from South Carolina is recognized.
How much time is left?
8 minutes on the Republican side, 9 minutes on the majority side.
Thank you. I'd like to, at this time, yield 2 minutes to my friend from Mississippi, Senator Wicker, who's a member of the Armed Services Committee.
Senator from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise in strong support of this resolution because Iran represents the single largest threat to freedom and peace in the Middle East. Our State Department classifies Iran as the most active state sponsor of terrorism, period. A troubling news account from Reuters released just yesterday reveals that a United Nations Nuclear Agency report due this week is expected to show Iran further increasing its capacity to produce material that could eventually be put to developing atomic bombs. The clock is ticking. This is a moment to be resolute. And the forceful words we just heard from the distinguished chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and previously from the distinguished senior senator from Arizona, demonstrate our firm bipartisan position on this matter. The world can ill afford the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran. That's why it is incumbent on the Congress and the President to take every action necessary to prevent Iran from acquiring a weapon of mass destruction. All options must be on the table, as the resolution indicates, to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. Mr. President, Israel is a nation under siege by terrorist organizations, many of whom are being directly funded by the Iranian regime. The United States must not waver in its support and obligation to our friends in Israel. I'm pleased that this resolution reaffirms our commitment to Israel, particularly in the event Israel is forced to exercise its sovereign right to defend itself. I urge my colleagues to take a firm stand against nuclear proliferation by voting for strengthened sanctions and for the adoption of this resolution. And I yield back whatever time I may have remaining.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut, senior senator from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to express my support, my strong support for this resolution, and to thank our colleagues, Senator Graham, Senator Menendez, for their leadership, and to thank them also for giving me the privilege of working with them over the last years on this vitally important national security issue. It is vital not just to the existence of Israel, it is an existential issue for Israel, but to the national security of the United States. And I believe that Israel is a crucial ally of the United States and a successful democratic state in the Middle East. Recent turmoil in that region adds urgency and importance to ensuring that Israel remains a secure, stable, independent state at peace with its neighbors. This resolution is a reaffirmation of the readiness of the United States of America to assist Israel our steadfast partner in the region to thwart any measure of aggression made toward Israel by Iran. But it is also a reaffirmation of the policy long supported by this body, by our colleagues here, by all of us in a very personal and direct way, that we have the back of the President of the United States in his insisting on strong sanctions against Iran as long as it continues its development of nuclear capability. In the coming days, I'm going to be introducing, with my colleague, the senior senator of North Dakota, Senator Hoeven, a resolution that calls for free and fair elections in Iran. But regardless of the outcome of these elections, and they're likely to be sham elections, we can't avoid the sad fact that Iran has maintained its course and its commitment to nuclear development. The centrifuges are spinning. They're going. And more are brought online every day in this breakout toward nuclear capacity. So we have to be wary of false signals of hope and remain vigilant in our constant effort to secure against Iran faithfully pursuing nuclear weapons. Fruitless negotiations can't be our reason to call a halt to these sanctions. That can come only with compliance, verified compliance. We have to remain vigilant and remember that Iran has threatened to attack not only Israel, but the United States. It has substantiated those words with attacks on our troops in Iraq and on American civilians visiting or living in Israel. It is Israel who helps defuse those threats from Hamas and Hezbollah and all who have targeted Americans. If Iran chooses to declare war on Israel, if it ignores the path of peace the international community has repeatedly laid down for it, they must know that they do it at their peril. The United States supports our strategic partner Israel, and that's why I support Senate Resolution 65, because it demonstrates our full, unyielding, unstinting support for Israel if the unthinkable and the avoidable happens. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Unanimous consent request. Mr. President,
Senator from Mississippi is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that Ian Mulcahy, Emily Smale, and Donald Roush, legislative fellows on my staff, be granted floor privileges during the remainder of this Congress.
No objection, so ordered.
At this time,
Senator
I'd
from
like
South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you. I'd like to yield 5 minutes to my good friend from Texas, a strong supporter of the U.S.-Israel relationship, Senator Cornyn.
Mr. President.
The senior senator from Texas is recognized.
Mr. President, back in October 2012, two Iran experts at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies wrote a sobering article about the Iranian nuclear program. They concluded that despite years of international and unilateral sanctions, Iran's economy had been allowed to remain healthy enough to leave a vanishingly short period of time for sanctions to do the work that might possibly head off military action. 7 months have passed since that article was written, and over that period of time, the Iranians have upgraded their biggest uranium enrichment plant. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency has found credible evidence that Tehran has secretly been pursuing nuclear weapons technology. The United States renewed sanction waivers for countries that import substantial amounts of Iranian oil. President Obama installed a harsh critic of Iran's sanctions as his Secretary of Defense, and the Iranians continue to prop up Syria and its dictator Bashar al-Assad and transport deadly weapons to Hezbollah as well. In short, the Iranians are feeling emboldened, and America's credibility is being tested, and time is running out. For these reasons, I'm a proud co-sponsor of Senate Resolution 65 that would send a clear message that we are determined not just to contain Iran, but to prevent the Iranians from acquiring a nuclear weapon. It would also send a clear message that the United States will stand with Israel if our Democratic ally is forced to take military action in legitimate self-defense. I would also add, Mr. President, that I've joined my colleague from Illinois, Senator Kirk, in introducing a separate bill, the Iran Export Embargo Act, which would further expand U.S. sanctions by prohibiting companies from doing business with any entity that is owned or controlled by the government of Iran. More specifically, our bill would prohibit all export-related transactions conducted on behalf of Iranian government entities, and it would block their assets. One final point, Mr. President. The Iranians are not just waiting to see how we beef up sanctions. They're also waiting to see how we respond to Syria's apparent use of poison gas. After all, President Obama famously warned the Assad regime that deploying chemical weapons would be tantamount to crossing a red line. And yet, the White House is walking back its red line comments and issuing retroactive qualifiers. You can be sure that the mullahs are taking notes, and you can be sure that the outcome of the Syrian civil war will help determine the outcome of the Iranian nuclear crisis. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from South Carolina is recognized.
How much time is left?
Senator, there's 2 minutes remaining.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Senator Cornyn and every person who spoke today and all the senators who co-sponsored it. I want to thank Senator Reid for making the time available. Senator Menendez has been a terrific partner, the strongest voice one could hope for, and having a partner on the Democratic side to stand at a time when it matters. In conclusion, on March 4th, 2012, the President said, Obama, when the chips are down, I have Israel's back. Mr. President, you were right then, and today the Senate will speak with one voice echoing what you said. There's a lot of wonderment about what's going to happen with the Iranian nuclear program. I hope and pray that they stop their nuclear ambitions because they don't want a nuclear reactor, they want a nuclear weapon. If they ever get one, we'll never be safe. Israel will be under the gun for the rest of its existence. They'll share the technology with the terrorists. Every Sunni Arab state will want a nuclear weapon to counter the Shia Persians, and all hell will break out beyond what it is today in the Mideast. How do you prevent that? Sanctions, diplomacy. But the one thing you cannot have in doubt is what we would do if Israel had to act in her self-defense to stop the nuclear ambitions of an Iranian regime who has promised to wipe the state of Israel off the map. After today, in about 10 or 15 minutes, I believe every member of the United States Senate will be telling the Iranians, we're not going to allow you to get a nuclear weapon because if you do, you throw the world into chaos. It will threaten our very existence as well as the state of Israel. But most importantly, we're going to tell everybody in the Mideast and throughout the world, in Tehran, Jerusalem, and Tel Aviv, that if there's a conflict where Israel is justified in defending herself against a nuclear-capable Iran, we will be there for you. We will have your back. And where I come from, when you tell somebody you have their back, that means if you get in a fight for your very life, you can count on me to be there. So in this case, you can count on the American people through the United States Senate and our Commander-in-Chief to be there. If that day ever comes, and I pray it does not, if that day ever comes where Israel has to take military action, to our friends in Israel, we will be there with you at every step of the way, diplomatically, economically, and yes, militarily. And to the Iranian people, we would love to have a better relationship with you. To the Iranian regime, you're one of the biggest evils on the planet, and we will stand up to you. We will stand by our friends, and your desire to throw the world into chaos is never going to happen because we will be there when necessary to stop your ambitions. So to every colleague who's taken time out to sponsor this resolution, to have taken time out to speak on the floor, thank you. There's not much we agree on 100%, but I think today will be a major milestone in our efforts to secure Israel and the United States. I think today we will have 100% support by the United States Senate to stand by our friends in Israel and stand up to the thugs in Iran. With that, I yield. Anybody else got any? How much time is?
Majority has 3 minutes and 45 seconds.
Going once? Going twice? I would see if our friends on the other side, do you have, see if we have a speaker? Okay, if we could just wait for a second. Senator Coates, we'll recognize him for a minute.
I want to thank
Senator
you.
from Indiana is recognized.
I want to thank my colleague from South Carolina for bringing this forward. We have implemented now another set of sanctions, and there's still some question as to whether sanctions will succeed and bring about the result that we want. But I particularly want to commend my colleague for his statement just a few moments ago relative to the commitment of the United States toward the security and the safety and the preservation of Israel in the light of this threat that exists in Iran. For years and years and years, the clock has been ticking as the Iranians pursue nuclear weapons capability. We know that for a fact. And we need to exert every possible measure that we can to give them reason not to go forward and do this. And that involves everything from diplomacy to pressure through multinational organizations, through sanctions, and ever tightening, ever ratcheting sanctions against them, but also the commitment to use whatever force may be necessary. And I, along with my colleague, I pray that this doesn't happen. But Iran absolutely has to know that the United States will be standing shoulder to shoulder with the nation of Israel. And if they level their gun sights at Israel, they're going to see us in the scope, standing shoulder to shoulder. We are committed to that. We're committed to doing everything that we possibly can to prohibit and prevent Iran from achieving this nuclear capability. But we will take whatever steps are necessary if they use it, if they gain that and they use it for inappropriate purposes or any purposes other than production of medical devices and products as well as providing power, which they don't need to do. So I just trust also that we have a 100% vote on this so that we send a very strong signal to Iranians that we will not tolerate their going forward with this. I thank my senator for yielding the time.
If I don't see any other speakers, Mr. President, I'd yield back all the time.
Without objection, all time is yielded back. The question is on adoption of S.Res. 65. Is there sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Bekich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Blumenthal, Brown, Carper, Coates, Crapo, Enzi, Franken, Graham, Isaacson, Klobuchar, Rubio, Schumer, Shaheen, and Wicker. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Beckidge? Aye.
Before we get all marked up,
Mr. Toomey? Aye.
I will make a
Ms. Heitkamp? Aye. Mr. Paul? Aye. Ms. Ayotte? Aye. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mrs. Murray? Aye. Mr. Cowan? Aye. Mr. Flake? Aye. Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Sessions? Aye. Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Donnelly? Aye. Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? Aye. Mr. Cochran? Aye. Mr. Vitter? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Mr. Johans? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Casey? Aye. Mr. Schatz? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mr. King? Aye. Mr. Cornyn? Aye. Mr. Corker? Mr. Corker? Aye. Ms. Hirono? Aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Sanders? Aye. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski? Aye. Mr. Chambliss? Mr. Chambliss? Aye. Mr. Burr? Mr. Burr? Aye. Ms. Landrieu? Aye. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Mrs. Hagan? Aye. Mr. McConnell? Aye. Mr. Leahy? Aye. Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nelson? Aye. Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby? Aye.
Yeah, we're ready.
Mr. Coburn? Mr. Coburn? Aye. Mr. Roberts? Mr. Roberts? Aye. Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley? Aye. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado? Aye. Mr. Cardin? Mr. Cardin? Aye. Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Inhofe? Mr. Inhofe? Aye.
We can agree on something.
Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mrs. Boxer? Mrs. Boxer? Aye. Mr. Baucus? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill? Aye. Mr. Kirk? Aye. Mr. Barrasso? Aye. Mr. Heller? Mr. Heller? Aye. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico? Aye. Mr. Hatch? Aye. Mr. Thune? Aye. Mr. Harkin? Aye. Mr. Bozeman? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mr. Scott? Aye. Ms. What? Mr. Blunt? Aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Aye.
McCain.
Mr. McCain. Aye. I just
Is agreed. Anyone wishing to cast their votes? The yeas are 99, the nays are 0. SRES 65 as amended is agreed to. Under the previous order, the preamble is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is considered, made, and laid on the table. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S954. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate, equally divided in the usual form prior to a vote in relation to the Shaheen Amendment number 925. Senate will be in order.